Well, today we are finishing up our sermon series on memorials. We've been talking about how Israel's journey and Jesus' journey and our journey are similar. And in these journeys, we're called to make memorials, to remember certain things, to remember what God has done at certain times and in certain events of our life. And today we're finishing up by remembering Israel and their entry into the Promised Land. And of course, Jesus has a similar entry into the Promised Land, and that is being seated at the right hand of the Father in heaven. And we also have an entry into the Promised Land. And so we want to look at the memorials that Israel was called to set up and how those might apply to our life. So we're going to look at Joshua chapter 4 today, and we'll start in verse 1 and go to verse 7 there. And what we want to do is think about what's happening here. Remember that Israel was in captivity in Egypt, and then God brought them through the wilderness. And remember that they didn't have faith. They didn't have faith that God would do what He said He would do. And so when they saw the Promised Land, and they saw that it was a good land, but they saw just how strong the people that were there were, that what the opposition that faced them in entering that Promised Land, they saw how strong that opposition was. They didn't have faith, and so their whole generation wandered around in the wilderness until they had died out. And then a new generation is called, and in Deuteronomy, they're kind of mustered and sent in. There's a second giving of the law there, and they're sent into the Promised Land. And that's what happens here in the beginning of the book of Joshua, is they're being finally sent into the Promised Land. And in Joshua chapter 4, verse 1, it says, "When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, 'Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, Take 12 stones from here, out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you, and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight.' Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, 'Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, What do those stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord. When it passed over the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever.'" So what's happening here is that just as God took Israel out of Egypt in a miraculous way when He parted the Red Sea, so as they're going into the Promised Land, He's doing something very similar. The priests go into the Jordan, and they stand there with the ark, and the waters of the Jordan stop, allowing Israel to cross over on dry land. And so they're to take these 12 stones from the riverbed, and they're to build a memorial to God. And so in future generations, when people say, what does that pile of stones mean?" They can tell them about this magnificent event that God had caused to happen because of His love for them. Now, what is it that we're looking at here today? We're looking at the memorial, the remembrance that God has promised to bring us into the Promised Land. And we're going to look at three things today. We're going to look at promised lands, we're going to look at a Sabbath rest, and we're going to look at kingdoms and kingship. And as we start here, let's look at promised lands, and we have to understand, well, what does it mean to go into the promised land? What is it that's special about this? Is it just another piece of real estate? No, the promised land is a few different things. It's a place of life, it's a place of reward, and it's a place of law. And so let's look at those one at a time. It's a place of life. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, when they're getting ready to head into the promised land, this is what it says. It says, "Now this is the commandment, the statutes, and the rules that the Lord your God commanded me to teach you, that you may do them in the land to which you are going over to possess, that you may fear the Lord your God, you and your son's son, by keeping all His statutes and commandments, which I command you, all the days of your life, and that your days may be long. Hear therefore, O Israel, and be careful to do them, that it may go well with you, and that you may multiply greatly, as the Lord, the God of your fathers, has promised you, in a land flowing with milk and honey." So what's happening here? Well, this promised land is a place of life, and it's in contrast to Egypt, which is a place of death. Well, what does that mean exactly? Well, does it mean physical life? Well, that's part of it. You know, all of us have a need for some knowledge. We have a need for some blessing. We have a need for some wisdom if we're going to gain physical life. Right? How many of you eat a healthy diet? You want to fess up to that? You didn't this morning because we had pancakes for breakfast, right? So everybody's feeling carb heavy right now. We're going to all start falling asleep pretty soon. I'll forgive you if that happens. It's our own fault, right? Feeding you guys pancakes and syrup. So the thing is that what does it mean to eat a healthy diet? Does anyone know? How many of you guys remember that, like, there was this food pyramid? You guys remember? Growing up, they taught us the food pyramid, right? And what is it that you need at the bottom of the food pyramid? What's the thing that you need the most of? Carbohydrates. Man, we fed you guys healthy today. Do they still tell you to eat that way? No. See, the thing is that it depends on who you ask. It depends on who you ask. It depends on when you ask. The keys of physical life are actually a lot more complicated than we thought. What seemed so obvious earlier doesn't seem obvious now. Why? Because the keys of physical life are very, very difficult. You need a lot of wisdom. You need a lot of discernment. The Promised Land is a place of physical life. It's a place of wisdom and discernment. But more than that, it's a place of spiritual life. And what does that mean? Well, it means two things. It means love and law. And those are an interesting combination. It's funny because when we read things like Deuteronomy chapter 6, and it says, this is the commandment. Like we feel like when you read that word in your head, you say, commandment. Isn't that the way the word seems like it needs to be read? This is the commandment. No, it's just me. It's just me. That's the way it seems to me. Is like it's like this heavy word. It's like it should rumble. And yet, when you read the psalmist, and he talks about the law of God, he talks about loving the law of God. Why? Because the law of God was given to us for our good. The commands were commands of life. Like if somebody commanded you, I want you to go down. They hand you a lottery ticket and they say, I want you to go down to the lottery office and hand this in. It's the winning ticket. This is my command to you. Do you go, oh, well, now that you put it that way, I'm not taking this. No. Right? You would be overjoyed. This would be a commandment of blessing. And in the same way, that's the way that the Old Testament people, the people of God, the Israelites, that's the way they saw these commandments. Is that there was no distinction between love and law because every aspect of the law was wrapped up in love. The thing is, we need to have an ideal. We need to have something that's defined as good. Like every one of us, we can't live without something that we hold up to in our minds and we say, this is good, this is what I will pursue. And we all have it in different areas. You might say, oh, I want to be the best guitarist that I can be. You have this idea in your head and you pursue it. Or you might say, I want to be the best singer I can be. I want to be the best parent I can be. And you hold up this ideal. Well, the problem is, it's very simple, that when you have an ideal, you will never ever reach it. You know what I'm talking about? You're never, ever going to reach your ideal. Why? Because when have you become the best guitarist that's possible? When have you gotten to the point where you can no longer make any no progress is not only possible for you, but it's not possible ever. Nobody could ever become a greater guitarist. Nobody could ever become a greater parent than you are now. You've reached it. Here you are. You're on the mountain. No. So what happens is, something interesting is we need this ideal. It's a good thing. We need to pursue it. But then the ideal always stands in judgment over us. And because it always stands in judgment over us, it always condemns us, doesn't it? And so we have this difficulty that we have to navigate is, how do we live without an ideal? Well, we can't. Well, how do we live with an ideal? Well, we can't. And how does God solve that problem? He solves that problem with love and law. He's the law, He's the ideal, He's the thing that we pursue. But because we will never reach it, He's also love. And what that means is it's provision. That God not only holds up the ideal, but then He provides the ideal to us. And that's what Jesus was. Jesus was the ideal. You can't get any higher than that. You can't get any better than that. You can't get any more perfect than that. And God hands His righteousness, hands His perfection to us. So not only do we have a standard, but we have provision. That's what it means to live in the promised land. To have perfection to aim for, and yet at the same time not be condemned. That is the spiritual place of the promised land. So it's a place of life, but it's also a place of reward. Now, the Israelites, when they go into the promised land, they're going to have all these vineyards that they don't plant in these orchards and all this stuff, walls and cisterns that they didn't dig, and it's going to be a great place, cities that they didn't build. And it's interesting because there's this concept in the Bible that's used to be talked about a lot, but we don't talk about it anymore because it's not good. What is that principle? The principle of spoiling the wicked. So that's this great principle in the Bible, and it's found here, and it's found throughout Scriptures, but we don't want to talk about it because it sounds so bad. How can we go in and take things away from the wicked? Well, we don't take them away. How many of you guys have ever seen the show Pawn Stars? Anyone ever seen that show? So these guys have this is genius. I don't know how more people have. Maybe they have thought of it. They just don't do a good job. But the idea of having a pawn shop in Las Vegas, that is genius. Why? Because if there's any place where people are looking for a pawn shop, it's Vegas, right? What happens, and if you've ever seen the show, you'll see this, where somebody will bring something in, and he goes, well, I can offer you this, and the guy goes, well, I think it's worth all this, and he goes, yeah, well, maybe to somebody, but I got to sit here and find that person, and it takes time and money. I have to keep a store open, I have to pay employees while I'm looking for that person that's going to pay this, and so this is what it's worth to me. You can take it or leave it. And the guy will take the money, and it'll be like a family heirloom, something that was in his family for a long time, but also has like historical value or something like that. And the guy will say something in the parking lot. You know, they always do those interviews in the parking lot. I think that's a good place for these interviews. And the guy will always say something like, well, I'm going to take my wife out to dinner tonight. Family heirloom. It's been in your family for centuries, and it's being turned into a dinner. Well, that's Las Vegas, isn't it? You see, what happens is that people value different things differently. And this idea of spoiling the wicked, what it means is that there's a proper way to value things. Certain things have an eternal value, that is their ultimate value, that is their real value. And what happens is certain people don't value those things, and when they don't value those things, they actually trade them away. And they trade them away for things of lesser value. Lesser value eternally, but greater value to them. You see, the problem is that that's really what it means to be righteous and wicked. The righteous value things the way God values them. They see their ultimate eternal value and they value them that way. But the wicked, they don't see that value. They value them in a different way. They have something else that they find that's more useful in the moment usually. And so what they do is they trade those things in. And this is the way that life works. It's true for all things, including relationships. In John chapter 4, verse 35, there's this great passage where Jesus says, do not say, there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest. Or do you not say, there are yet 4 months, then comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white for harvest. He's saying there's harvest all around you. What does he mean by that? He's saying there's people that are ready to enter the kingdom of God. Why? Well, they're part of the kingdom of Satan. They're part of the kingdom of evil. But here's the thing, the kingdom of evil, Satan doesn't value you the way that you really should be valued. We just talked about how God sends His Son for the purpose of dying to reconcile to us. That's the value that God places on you. Does Satan place that value on you? Does Satan say, I'm willing to die for you that you might have life? No. And yet He holds the whole earth. But once people hear that there's a God who values them a certain way, they're ready to make that movement away from the kingdom of evil into the kingdom of light. And what Jesus is saying, there's people everywhere who are not being valued by the current king. And everywhere you look are people who, if they knew the way that God values them, would be willing in a heartbeat to change sides. Do you know that this is actually at work all the time around you? I meet a lot of people, and there are people who say, I wish I had more relationships, I wish I had more friends, and I can totally understand that. I've been at that place in my life. But you know what I've discovered? Is that there are relationships all around you. There are people who, through their life, have not been valued. And sometimes those people find adoption. They find adoption into new friendships. They find adoption into new families. They find somebody who values them in a way that nobody else ever has. And if you are that person who is willing to value somebody the way that God values them, you will never have a lack of opportunities. You will never have a lack of relationships. You see, that's what it means to spoil the wicked. That's what it means to go in and find a land that's there. It's not that you take it away from them, it's that it's offered to you by some people who, in some things that don't value them the way that they should be. That's the place of reward. It's also, finally, a place of law, a relationship to God that's based on eternal principles. How do you relate to somebody? The funny thing is every relationship has its laws. If it doesn't, it's just utter chaos. It's completely undiscernible. It really destroys the whole meaning of relationship. And so God offers this place, a place of life, a place of reward, and a place of law. This is what it means to enter the promised land for Israel. And that's what it means to enter the promised land for us. And we do that ultimately after we die and we go to heaven. But we do that progressively as Christians as we become more and more close to God, more and more shaped by who He is. So we have the idea of promised land, but we also have the idea of Sabbath rest. Now the interesting thing is Israel, as they're going into the promised land, they're ordered to keep the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is this day of rest, that they're supposed to not do their regular work. But they're supposed to devote that day to God. Now the interesting thing is it's supposed to be a day of rest. Now, rest is not about, in the Old Testament, theologically, rest isn't not about doing nothing, right? It's not about, getting on your couch on a Saturday morning at like 7 a.m. and turning on Netflix and not moving for the rest of the day. That's not what rest is about in the Old Testament. What is rest? Rest, actually, in the Old Testament, this sounds weird, but rest in the Old Testament is a cessation, a ceasing from trusting yourself. That's really what rest is. It's a ceasing from trusting in yourself. You're going to stop trusting in yourself and in your efforts, and you're going to trust God. Remember that when Israel was in the wilderness and they started practicing this Sabbath, it wasn't yet fully developed yet because they weren't in the promised land, but they were practicing like a form of the Sabbath there. And what happened was, remember that they were collecting manna every day, but on the Sabbath they weren't supposed to collect it. And some people did, and it got all spoiled and gross. It was like McDonald's French fries 17 years later. Looks the same, but really isn't. So that's the way that it was, right? It was not the same. They couldn't eat it. And what happened is that what they were being taught is there's this day where you're going to put your trust fully in God. You're going to stop trusting your efforts to take care of yourself, to provide for yourself, and just see what happens. Just see what it's like to trust in God. And the day is supposed to be a day of joy and celebration. That's why it had to be commanded. Does that make sense? It doesn't, does it? But that's the way it works. Days of celebration have to be commanded. Why? Because if we're not commanded to celebrate, we won't. Why? Because we're naturally anxious people. Because we trust in ourselves and we always could use a little bit more. Is there anybody here who could use just a little bit more? A little bit more free time? A little bit more expendable money? A little bit more anything? We could always use a little bit more. All of us are here today. None of us starved to death. But we could use a little bit more. You see, that's the problem with trusting in ourselves. We actually have to be commanded to stop doing that so that we can sit there and celebrate. You know, the interesting thing is in the Middle Ages, a lot of the monks had this strange thing where they saw prayer and play as connected. Isn't that weird? How many of you go, time for prayer time, and then you jump on your Xbox? Feels like cheating, doesn't it? That's not what I'm suggesting, by the way. But the Middle Ages monks might. They would say that, hey, why is that? Because they saw a connection between the two. Because in prayer, we trust in God. And to cease actually doing something useful and do something completely useless just for the joy of life, they saw that as requiring trust in God, just like prayer did. The Sabbath rest was a day to stop trusting in yourself and start trusting in God. It was a practice for an eternity. What does rest bring us? Well, rest brings us peace and joy and love. You know, love is really kind of useless. I'm a pastor. I'm telling you. Love is really pretty useless, isn't it? Have you ever seen somebody really in love? They're the most useless people in the world. You know what I'm talking about, right? If you were ever a teenager, you experience this. When you're in love, you're useless. You can't do anything right. You can't do anything useful. People finally just say, just go away, right? Because you're always messing things up. Why? Because you're thinking about somebody. You're not thinking about useful things. You're not thinking about your job. You're not thinking about your task. You're not thinking about your future. All you're thinking about is this other person. It's totally useless. You know what's really useful is using other people. No, seriously. Very useful. That's why the world does it so much. The world uses everybody. It doesn't experience love. Love is useless. In fact, you're a fool if you love. You can be taken advantage of if you love. It's much better to actually protect yourself and use other people. Now, please don't go tell people that that was the point of the sermon today. That's actually a negative example. You see, what rest brings us, it brings us the ability to love. Without rest, without a trust in God, you can't love. Because your natural anxiety and your reliance on yourself will treat everything as a tool to meet those needs that you're afraid won't be met. What a terrible way to live. And that's why... Was that me? Nope, it wasn't. It sounded just like me. Am I hearing things or did that happen? It happened. Okay, good. So the thing is that the ability to rest brings love. It brings joy. It brings the ability to actually celebrate. And it brings peace, the ability just to not be anxious. It also brings the ability to persevere through tough times. Man, if you trust in God, it doesn't matter how bad things get. You think to yourself, God can always redeem this. And it gives you hope in the blessings to come. See, that was the Sabbath rest that Israel was called to. What are the results of rest? A celebration of God, a trust in Him, and a celebration of the fact that He is worthy. And the celebration of God meant there's no work, there's a reliance on God for the physical needs and the spiritual needs. But how can you trust in God? How can you take your trust off of yourself and actually put it on God? Well, this is what the ancient people believed that God was. This is the qualities that He had. First of all, He was omniscient. That meant that God knew everything. You see, you can't really place your full trust in somebody that doesn't know everything. This is the problem with trusting in ourselves. Like, we can have a pretty high opinion of ourselves, but all of us have to admit at some point that we don't know actually everything. We maybe occasionally get things wrong. Well, what if those times are really important times? You see, God is omniscient. That means that He knows everything. There's never a gap in His knowledge. He knows everything. He's also omnipresent. What happens is that God, what it means is that God is present everywhere. There's no place you can go to where God doesn't exist. There's no pit of hopeless despair that you've ever found yourself in that God can't be there. You know, we've talked in the past about different people who are great examples of this. Like the Nick, I always mess up his last name, so I won't say it, the guy that was born with no arms and no legs. And at 8 years old wanted to end his own life. And now goes around the world speaking to people, encouraging them, especially people who are handicapped, who has a wife and a wonderful family. Like, he went to that bottom place and he found that God was there, that God had a purpose, that God's love was found even in that terrible place. God is omnipotent. He can do anything. His power is unlimited. God is also truth. He will never lie to you. And most importantly, He is love. In 1 John chapter 4, verse 8, it says, anyone who does not love does not know God, because God is love. You see, all those other things would be kind of terrifying if God wasn't also love. Like, think about a God who's omniscient, knows everything. He's omnipresent. He's everywhere. He's omnipotent. He can do everything. And He doesn't like you much. That's terrifying. But God is love. And on top of all these, maybe the greatest thing is that He's immutable. In Malachi 3:6 it says, for I, the Lord, do not change, therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed. All those qualities that we said of God, they will never change. So what is necessary then to enter into rest? Well, Hebrews actually tells us about this. In Hebrews chapter 4, verses 1 through 3. It says, therefore, while the promise of entering His rest still stands, let us fear lest any of you should seem to have failed to reach it. For good news came to us just as to them, but the message they heard did not benefit them because they were not united by faith with those who listened. For we who have believed enter that rest, as He has said, as I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest, although His works were finished from the foundation of the world. What is that verse telling us? What it's saying is the book of Hebrews is written in the New Testament, and it's comparing us who live now with those Old Testament people. And it's saying, you know what? All those Old Testament people, they had the opportunity for the promised land. They had the opportunity to enter into the Sabbath rest. But you know what? It didn't do them any good. All those qualities of God, who God was, it didn't do them any good. All the love of God, it didn't do them any good. All the faithfulness of God, it didn't do them any good. Why? Because they didn't believe it. They didn't have faith in it. They didn't trust it. They couldn't take their trust off of themselves and actually put it on God. So they couldn't experience the Sabbath rest, this picture of something that's supposed to be an eternal life of trusting in God. They couldn't even for a second enjoy it. And what this passage in Hebrews is saying is, let's not be like that. All of the qualities of God do us no good if we don't trust in them. I was thinking about what it would be like to have the most wonderful, loving person in your life ever, but you doubt their intentions. What's the difference between the most loving person? Oh, come on. You guys are married. Come on. So what is it like to have the most loving person in your life? The most loving person in your life, but to doubt their intentions. Here's the thing, what's really interesting is the person next to you the most loving person in the world or a master manipulator? Are they just that good? When I was in college, I had a Datsun 260Z. And that's how I got Angela. The best part of my 260Z was you had to start it with a screwdriver under the hood. And that's how I knew she wasn't in it for the car. But maybe she's just playing the long game, thinking someday, our ship will come in. What's the person next to you? Are they a master manipulator? You see, here's the thing. There's nothing that doubt cannot ruin. Think about it for a second. It literally is true. There's nothing that doubt cannot ruin. Somebody could come up to you and say, I will do anything, and you can always say, well, but that's what somebody was trying to fool me would do. There's nothing that can't be destroyed by doubt. And so the reality is that Israel, because they didn't trust in God, they didn't have faith in Him, they never experienced His rest. Well, let's finish up with kingdoms and kingship. There's something really interesting going on in this passage in Joshua. They're supposed to remember that God is taking them into the promised land, that He's taking them into Sabbath rest, but they don't. They forget. But there's something on a personal level that's going on with Joshua, and we see that in Joshua chapter 3, verse 7. So let's read that. It says, "The Lord said to Joshua, 'Today I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they may know that, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you.'" So the very chapter before this, where God miraculously stops the river, and they're supposed to remember that this God has the power and that He's bringing them into the promised land, bringing them into Sabbath rest. He says to Joshua, their leader, He says, "I am about to exalt you." What does that mean? He's about to lift him up. Why? Here's the thing. When Joshua trusts in God, he gets lifted up as an example to all of Israel. When Joshua trusts in God, that trust in God lifts him up, it exalts him, it glorifies him. You see, the interesting thing is God is not just doing something with all of us as a people, but He's doing something with us as individuals. And that something is that there's something bigger than you going on. And when you start to understand it, that there's something bigger than my likes and my dislikes and what I want for dinner and all of these things, when you start realizing that there's a God who is love and that God values the world in a certain way, you start to see that you can be part of that. You can be part of what God is doing. You can be part of the kingdom He's building. And when you trust in that, you can become a king. You know, there was an interesting documentary that was made a while ago. Peter Jackson, you know who he is, the guy that did Lord of the Rings. He did a documentary about World War I, and I think it was called They Shall Not Grow Old. And what he did is he took old World War I footage and he restored it, and they were real choppy back then because they didn't have enough frames, but he used a computer program to put in the movements that were missing, and so all of a sudden they became like regular people, and you all of a sudden you see these World War II people not as this weird kind of strangely moving black and white grainy people, but they become kind of real and alive, and you think, oh, those were real people. Well, as part of this, they went through the archives and they found all these interviews with World War I. And if you know anything about World War I, you probably know something like all's quiet on the Western Front, like everything was terrible. They ate gruel morning, noon, and night. They slept in the mud. Everything was terrible, right? Well, the interesting thing is when going through these archives, what they realized is that most of these men had a great time in World War I. These men actually report like having it be one of the most positive experiences of their life. And yet a lot of them did eat gruel morning, noon, and night. And they also slept in the mud. And they also had bombs coming in. And they also lost friends. And they had all these. And the question is how can both those things be true at once? How can so many of these World War I veterans, probably the worst war that we can imagine, how can they report saying that was a great time in my life and I remember it fondly? Well, when you dig a little deeper, what you find is that they had a purpose. Their life was about something bigger than themselves. And because they shared that purpose with other people, they had camaraderie and relationships that were stronger than any relationships before or after the war. God wants to make you a king in His kingdom. Not the king, but a king. God wants to give you honor. See, See, when you trust in God, you start to trust in God on behalf of others. Other people see you and they start to gain trust. Because you trust what you cannot see, it allows them to trust in you, which they can see. And it gives us the occasion to create and cultivate the thing that God is perhaps better at than anything we can imagine. God took the dust of the ground and He breathed breath into it, and He cultivates man. And everywhere God goes, He perfects and He glorifies. And we have the opportunity to do that as well. There's a great joy in being like God. Well, how do we apply what we've learned today? Well, we believe in God's glory. We meditate on the glory and provision of God. We meditate on God and how He's the only person that's qualified to truly put our trust in. And so we trust in Him. We belong to God through the covenant. The question to ask yourself today is, am I in a covenant with God? Are God and I unified? Do I trust in God wholly? Do I trust in Him? Do I see Him and His love as sure as my own love for myself? More sure. And then finally, we become glorious by being transformed to His goal of glory for us. God wants us to be glorious. And so we just participate in what He's doing in our lives. Once again, we want to invite you to work through our conversations with God this week. It's our daily devotional. If you just hold up your phone on your camera on that thing, something's supposed to happen. There's like electrons that go, and all of a sudden you're magically transported to that page. So we invite you to do that. Also, you can check out our Facebook page. We have our conversations about God there, where I talk to people in the congregation about these different topics that we've been going over. But we encourage you to be thinking about this through the week. Don't make this the only thing that you do this week in your relationship with God. Because the reward for trusting Him is to be a king in the promised land, a king at rest.
Thanks for joining our worship service today. Please follow us on our Facebook page, where you can let us know about any needs or prayer requests you may have, and keep up with the latest church news and events. You can also check out all of our past lessons and other videos by visiting our YouTube channel. At First Christian, we strive to be the presence of Christ in the world by helping others to believe in God's love for them, to belong to His church, and to become like Christ in their lives. If you would like to support us in our ministry, you may do so by giving online through our website at www.fcct.org or by mailing checks to the church. Have a great week.